Hey everybody, welcome to the show. I am here with my good friend Professor Todd Moore and the owner of Garcia Promotions, Eric Garcia. How you guys doing today?
Awesome. Good to have us back.
Good deal. Well, man, I'm excited about this because I have a lot to talk to you about, Eric. You know, we've been friends for a very long time. You're an active jiu-jitsu practitioner yourself. You've been training for many years, really good brown belt. And several years back, you started what has become one of the biggest, most successful MMA and grappling promotions in, I mean, not just the Houston, but now you've expanded out. We were talking just a minute ago about like kind of the behind the scenes part that not a lot of people see that it takes to not just start a business, but sustain and eventually thrive. And you seem to have done that. So I just want to pick your brain a little bit and talk a little bit about that. Tell us what kind of sparked your desire to get into this business.
As far as the MMA promotions, honestly, it all started with jiu-jitsu. So I walked into Team Tooke. It was probably 08 maybe, 07, 08.
Yep.
And right away I took a liking. You know, I was deep into like weightlifting and stuff, and I thought that I could get in there and I was going to be strong and I was going to be able to overpower these smaller guys. And little did I know that like the strength and stuff was not going to matter in it. So I got really serious with the jiu-jitsu. I did private lessons with Jeremy Trahan.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I had Jeremy. And
nice shout out to Jeremy Trahan.
Yeah, so Jeremy. And I think I did private lessons with him for like 6 months.
Right.
And then I reached out to y'all about a striking coach, and y'all introduced me to Jace.
Mm-hmm.
So I met Jace Petrie and started working on my striking. And then he found me a MMA fight. So I took my first MMA fight, and it was me and one of our other teammates on that card that night. And after that, you know, the MMA scene was growing, and there was only one promotion. I think it was Legacy, and they were Lone Star Beatdown back then, and they were doing amateur fights. They didn't start the pro events yet. And our team started growing, and we had teammates that wanted to fight, and they couldn't get fights. So I looked at it and I was like, well, I was running another business at that time. And I was like, you know, I can run a business. I'm an entrepreneur. I think I can look into this and I can get it done. So I started looking at the licensing and whatnot and filed for the license, went to Austin, did the interview, and I got licensed. So basically what got me into it was the demand for fights and really not enough promotions for these guys to fight on.
Do you remember the very first show you put on, and like,
Yeah.
How did you feel? Like, what was the level of nerves like going into that?
Yeah, it was pretty bad. So like I was the type of guy that right before I would fight, I would get really nervous. And I would always tell myself, I don't know if you remember when y'all would corner me, but I would always be like, look, this is it. Like, I don't know what I'm doing here, but this is the last fight that I'm going to have.
Right.
This is it. And then I would get the win, and I would be like, hey, Jace, coach, when's the next one?
Yeah.
When are we going to do the next one? But so when I ran that first event, I thought I had it like, okay, everything's ready. We're good. And I felt right before the show, I started getting those nerves, and I was like, oh, no, like it felt like a fight.
Yeah.
And the show and all in all went good, but it was one of those things that I felt like maybe I had jumped in too soon. And I ran that event, and it wasn't a profitable first one, but I was determined.
Right.
So after that show, like, I just went back to the drawing board. And
Let me ask this about what year was that? Because talking into as far as your first show, we didn't get a chance to talk about like how long ago was that? What year was that?
2010. That was
So-
2010.
So you've been promoting now for 10 years.
Going
and
on
so
10,
that's
yeah.
actually a solid run considering like we've seen a lot of shows come and go, and just the stability of Fury Fighting Championship is the attractive thing to fighters to show them that this is a solid show that's produced quite a few fighters into the bigger shows, you know, from Bellator to UFC. And so, I mean, for 10 years, that's actually a heck of a run because we've seen a lot of guys come and go.
You said something a minute ago that I thought was spot on. You know, and this happens for jiu-jitsu competitors, MMA competitors, business owners. You said it felt like a fight, and how you had this complete change in perspective when you won the fight versus how you felt before the fight, right?
Exactly.
And I understand that completely. Like sometimes I compete if I'm not feeling it. It's like, man, I don't know if I trained well enough for this. Am I ready for this? And I know, Todd, you could probably attest to all the different emotional states you go through leading up to a fight and then after. So why, and Todd, you also talked about how a lot of shows have come and gone. And that, I mean, I think that's any business. You have market, you have people that come in, and then when the dust settles, a lot of them are no longer in business. So been doing it for 10 years straight, and it can't be easy. There's no magic formula to this because things change and demographics change. And so what would you, what is your, what do you think keeps you going, and why have you been successful? Considering your first show, like you said, it wasn't real profitable for you. So what was it that kept you going to get to the place where you are now?
I think just determination, really. Like I've always had the mindset that nothing good comes easy. Mm-hmm. So I felt that, if I'm going to succeed at this, I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board. I'm going to have to look and see what I did wrong on that first show. And, what you have to look at the time of the month, fighters, if they're fighting in other places, everything that's going on. Like it's a complete, you have to look at it. There's a lot of different aspects that you have to look at going into making one of these fight cards. I thought that I was going in there and I was just going to put on fights and people were just going to show up and buy tickets, and I didn't push the fighters to sell tickets, which is a big part of it now. So there was many things that changed. I guess the biggest thing was really being approachable to these guys. Like me and Todd talked about that earlier. After that first show, I went into the gyms of all the guys that had fought, and I went and talked to them, and I thanked them for being part of the first event and for trusting me. Because there was a lot of promotions that, like Todd says, some come and go. And I feel like when I first went into my interview in Austin, the main guy, Greg Alvarez, was like, why do you want to do this? Or why do you think you're going to be able to do this? And I told him, I'm just determined. I'm involved. I fought. I know both sides of it, and I feel like they didn't think I was going to stick in it this long. But
well, elaborate just a little bit more on that, like the behind the scenes, because the finished, polished product of a Garcia Promotions event is you show up to a nice venue and the fighters come out on time. You have the referees and you have the judges. You have the concessions, and you've got the person announcing the fights, right? The ring announcer, and then you've got you standing there all dressed up nicely, and so it looks like that's just how it is, right? That's what you get, and I think, and I can relate to that from the perspective of running a jiu-jitsu school. It's like people come in, all the instructors are smiling, we're in uniform, the class are organized, but behind the scenes, it's often chaos. There's a lot of problems and putting out fires all the time. Right. And you touched a little bit on that with, trying to become more approachable, going and meeting the fighters, which I think is a very important part of it. What have been some of the other challenges trying to grow? Because initially, from my understanding, you start as an amateur show, but now you've got professional level events, and not just with like first time fighters. I mean, you've got some former UFC fighters, you got some big names fighting, and an event that's you have coming up February 23rd. I know we've got a big card there. So talk about basically the growing pains and what it took to get there.
Well, I think trust is huge, and back then in 2010, 2011, to try and get high caliber guys that had already been on other promotions, it was almost impossible.
Yeah.
They didn't know me from anybody else. I had just started building. People don't see that, like this February 23rd card that's coming up. I've been working on this card since end of November. They don't see the weeks and weeks of work behind the scenes, the guys that get hurt, they fall out. So not only do the fighters have to trust me, but I have to trust them that they're going to show up. And that's been huge, because there's a lot of fighters that'll message me and say, hey, I want to get a fight. I'm going to do my medicals. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And I set these deadlines, and here we are getting towards fight day, and They still haven't done medicals.
How do you deal with that? How do you deal with somebody? Because it's one thing if a fighter gets hurt,
Right.
that's not their fault. You know, they
Right.
can't do anything about that. If the commission changes rules, then you just have to go with the punches. But fighters that don't handle their responsibilities, that seems like it would be one of the bigger frustrations.
It is, and I tell him, I say, look, if this happens and this is how this ends, there's no more opportunity here.
Yeah.
Like, I can't do it.
I can also speak from the other perspective, from that fighter's perspective, as far as like Eric dealing with the reliability of the fighters. The thing that makes Eric different from all the other promoters is his approachability. And we were talking earlier about that all the hats he wears, that not only is he the promoter, but he has to get everything licensed. He has to be the matchmaker, and he has to talk to all these fighters. I was telling him earlier about all the hats he wears, because not only is he wearing the promoter hat and having to be on guys to make sure they get their medicals, he has to wear that the matchmaking hat, and he's got to contact fighters that will change their mind. They said, like, hey, I want to fight, and then as soon as he calls them, like, they say, oh, no, I can't, something else came up, or all the different personalities that are involved in MMA. And, I can speak, from my own ego and my own experience that he's dealing with a lot of guys with big egos, a lot of prima donnas, guys who have entitled attitudes, and just seeing how he handles it, I've always seen just the positive, and so he's seeing him with the positive attitude. And so Eric, tell me a little bit earlier, you were saying about one thing you learned to deal with was just the different characters.
Yeah, there's tons of different personalities, and I think the way you respond to certain situations is definitely going to produce a different outcome. Mm-hmm. So, if a fight falls out or somebody don't show up to weigh-ins or whatever, and I panic and I show people that, man, this event's falling apart, it makes me look bad. You have to be able to adapt and just make the best of whatever situation you can,
I feel like that would be the biggest challenge is, so I'll say it kind of from a martial arts school owner perspective, is in one school you have lots of personalities, but we've created sort of one culture where everyone, in spite of all of our different personalities, we've all agreed to, okay, well, these are the rules of the academy, and this is how we're going to, kind of comport ourselves and take part in this school. Running an MMA show, you don't get to do that. You just have to rely on different schools with different cultures, right, and different levels of ego. And it always, Todd and I, we were laughing about this, like when we see a guy who's 2-0 amateur, and he's like, where's my belt? And he's like, it's like, when, just like demanding that, like, the world owes me. I'm entertaining all these people. Okay, I sold 3 tickets, but big deal, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me, man. And then Todd on the other end, been fighting professionally for many, many years. And when you prepare for a fight, it's like, oh, okay, I need to try to sell this many tickets, and I need to make this weight, and I need to be there then. And it's not even something you second guess. It's just part of being a professional. So,
Where I think you're leading to that. So where I think you're leading with that is just like, well, one message we can pass on to, up and coming fighters is being reliable. And I know, like, from Eric's perspective, that he's got his go-to fighters, that if something happens, he knows he can call these guys, and he knows that these guys are going to show up on weight, they're going to have their medicals, they're going to sell the tickets that he asked them to sell. And so one thing I can deliver to upcoming fighters is handle yourself like a professional. If you're going to have aspirations to be successful in this business, it's not only be a stand-up fighter as far as like being owning up to your word, but be a stand-up guy. If you say that you're going to sell this amount of tickets, or if you say you're going to show up on this weight, then do everything in your power to make it. If mistakes happen, if you handle yourself with a level of dignity, people are going to understand, and people are going to be forgiving when you make mistakes. But a lot of these guys, like, they'll show up with, like, well, here, I know I said sell this many tickets, but this is what I got. Right. Or there's even I know you've been stiffed a couple times too, and so I know, and you've handled it, perfectly. You've handled it with a heck of a lot more composure than I would have, and probably like anybody else would have that we can think of. And so that's why you're at where you're at. So fighters, be reliable. Stick to your word. Don't be a scumbag.
Well, like I say, like at the beginning, it wasn't like that. I would panic and I would be like, man, what am I gonna do? This guy was supposed to sell 50 tickets and he sold 5. So you worry about stuff, but now I've gotten to the point where I'm comfortable in what I do. And Professor Travis had mentioned earlier, like we started with amateur shows. So the first 2 years, I think, I ran just all amateur cage combat shows from 2010 to the end of 2012. And then in 2013, me and Jace together got licensed to run Fury fighting.
Yep.
And that was the first pro show. You fought on that first pro card.
I remember.
You fought
and
on
it was
that first
very
pro
professional. And I was terrified.
Yeah.
So I was like, are you ready? I was like, of course I'm ready. And then on the inside, I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? Yeah. And I had just a quick, story. I had the similar feeling, as soon as they shut the cage, like just the first thought is like, what the hell did I just sign on for? Yeah. One of the best memories of my life. And I'm so glad it was with the organization because that just being connected with and Todd fought on the card too, so it was a amazing life experience for me. And on that note, like the amateur versus professional, I remember, or I just have to put this out there, I think your motives for running professional fights are very pure, because I remember as you started to really get the amateur game down and you were becoming successful, and now you have the choice to go into the professional world where you have to pay out money. Right. And my perspective was kind of like, man, just do amateur shows, man. Like, if you can make money and, you can do it that way. And, but I think, that's, kind of my limited thinking. I'm not in that. You clearly have a passion for growing the sport, and it's more than just about, it's not a side hustle for you, and so I think we could talk for hours about all the problems and all the the behind the scenes and the stress and the frustration of just dealing with other human beings. But when you put in the time like you did, and you make the dedication to overcome these challenges, now you got to where you are today, and now you have some really big things happening where you've connected to these bigger organizations. The UFC and Bellator and these organizations are looking at what you're doing, and fighters that are coming through these are connected to this bigger world. So talk a little bit about kind of where things are now, the future, your upcoming events, everything else.
Well, we're at a point, the first years we were strictly Texas-based. And just last year we got licensed in Florida, we got licensed in Louisiana, and we got licensed in Colorado. So now that we're moving out of state and we're doing shows, like more doors are opening, we're getting more followers. I've got Chris Lopez and Rich Burmaster helping me match cards, which has been a big help. Because Rich used to work with LFA.
Right.
And he left LFA, but because he traveled with them across the nation for all their shows, he has doors that are open for him that he can contact, and he's brought new guys that I didn't know. Chris moved to Colorado, and he trained at Factory X that produces a ton of UFC fighters.
Right.
So he knows a lot of the gyms out there. But not only that, now that we're moving to these other states, we have like bigger managers that are tied in with the UFC that are calling us on a daily basis saying, hey man, I've got this guy in Hawaii that we really want to get on a card. Can we get him flown down there and y'all just make the fight?
Yeah.
So we have people that are willing to help us. I had a guy with First Round Management call us this past weekend wanting to give us like a tequila sponsor.
Nice.
So, doors are opening, and obviously the ultimate goal is to try and get TV. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty content right now where it's at and at the pace that we're growing, because I'm hands-on everything, like obviously from start to the end. And I'd like to get it to a point where I can just show up, run the show, and leave, but it's not there yet. But hopefully TV's coming soon. That's the ultimate goal.
But currently though, you have live live stream though, and you're
Right.
streaming live from Fight TV.
Fight TV, yeah.
And you've been streaming the last couple of years though, and so that's where kind of the reason why I'm here. I'm not just the third wheel. It's because for the last 4 years,
Come on, Todd.
I know.
You're the no, I'm kidding.
Looking to sweep on in, but no. The last 4 years I've been, cage side, been calling the action as a commentator, and I've actually have judged several of the Fury Fighting Championship fights, and so we have that upcoming card in February 23rd. And so, who's the main event for that upcoming February 23rd card?
We have Jacob Silva and Christian Lira. So it's a 125 title fight. I'd say that Jacob is probably top 5 in Texas for sure. Top 10, I'd say, in like the lower regions. This kid's work ethic is ridiculous. He works a regular job and he gets up in the morning and runs before work and goes to work, takes his lunch break and goes and runs and leaves work and goes straight to train on top of having a family and stuff. So he's serious. And, I mean, his goal obviously is to be in the UFC. So,
well, I mean, yeah, he has. I mean, I didn't know that backstory of I've seen him on paper. He hasn't lost in 5 years. He's on a 5-fight win streak. He's going against Lira. And Lira is a very long-time veteran of the area, fought in Submission Hunter, fought in Fury, and he's a very credible opponent. He's coming off of a win himself. I think Silva has a lot of momentum coming into this fight. It's going to be a pretty explosive main event, and it's going to top off a couple other like really action-packed fights that evening.
Right. The co-main event, Ricky Tercius coming back. Ricky fought for us. I think his last fight was a year and a half ago, and he fought Leomano Martinez, who's our current bantamweight champion. He's fighting Caleb Petey at a Pete Spratt's gym from San Antonio. But I'm excited to see Ricky. He's been training at Alpha Male with Faber. So I'm excited to see what he's bringing.
Yeah, I knew Ricky from back when he would train. I knew Ricky from a couple of years ago before he moved to California. I used to train him at Gracie Baja before he moved to Alpha Male in California. And he was on a tear. He was 9-0, got a shot at the not the Ultimate Fighter, but the other show where they have the upcoming fighters fight for the contract and on a fight card. And
Contender.
Yeah, the Contender Series. And then Ricky went 9-0, and then he lost in the Contender Series. Then from there, he came back and fought Leo Martinez, and then Leo stopped him, and that was a big shocker. I wasn't expecting that. And then since then, Leo's been on a tear. And if there's anybody, one of the many up-and-comers here in the Houston area, I think Leo's got a really good shot in getting some momentum, maybe one win away, or actually, like, if the timing is right, he could actually pick up a contract right now for one of the bigger shows. And from there, Eric, we have Nico Echeverry coming back after kind of a controversial championship fight in his last performance. So, we were cage side watching that fight, and he was fighting for the lightweight championship against Victor Martinez, and that was just kind of a questionable early stoppage by the ref. I don't want to take anything away from Martinez, but that was one that we were really hoping to see a rematch of in the future. But I guess Victor signed on with to fight other places.
Yeah,
so.
he signed on with Combate, I think. Combate Americas.
Okay, yeah. I got you. And then he. Speaking of Nico, he's taken on one of my favorite fighters in the area, which is Derek Adjade. And so Derek Adjade, he's got quite a few losses on his record for his early part of his career. But I mean, he's getting matched up with just the monsters of the area. Right. And so he was taking on Will Morris, Charlie Ontiveros, and I've never seen a bad fight from Adjade. That's why he's one of my favorite fighters to watch and to call. And so he's that should be a pretty explosive fight.
These two guys are both guys these are two guys that I can call and tell them, hey, look, I have a fight for you. And they ask me who it is, and I tell them who it is, and they're like, okay, send the contract. And there's nowadays it's rare to be able to call and offer somebody a fight, and they just say, okay, yeah, I'll take it. It's gotten to that point where you have to have 4 or 5 options for somebody, and it's not a season where, okay, I'll just fight anybody.
So how important is that? Because I feel like people would say two things. Like one is like, oh, I'll fight anyone
Right.
at any time, and that's not always a wise career choice.
Correct.
But the other end of that is being too picky too early in the game. Like you've
Right.
had 2 pro fights and you're trying to call too many shots where, you might get overlooked or burn some bridges. What's the happy, ground right there?
I think if you're going to pick and choose your opponents, I think within the first 3 or 4 fights. I think earlier in your career you should be able to do it. But once you're 8, 9 fights in, if I call you and say, hey, I got this guy, he's 5-0, and you're 8-3 or something like that, there's probably
You gotta take it.
Yeah, it's time to go. Like this is going to be a fight that you can knock this guy off who's never lost, he's undefeated, and possibly get looked at by a bigger organization.
Yeah. How often do you think fear of reputation or just fear of losing plays in that decision? Because I understand some people saying, well, it's not the right time. It's my, for my career. But I think some people, obviously, there are some people who will just simply refuse to fight or dodge, fights
Right.
and try to go around it as long as they can. But eventually, when you're moving up, another guy's moving up, it's time for you two to meet to see who's going to take that next step in that, top direction, right?
It's tricky because, like, when you have 2 guys that are moving up together and they're both from the same area and in the same weight class, for me, I have to make the decision, like, do I match these 2 guys together and let one knock the other off?
Yeah.
Or is there a way for me to get them both to the next level and maybe they fight later on?
Right.
So it's difficult. I mean, there's a lot of things that you have to look at that people don't really look at.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and that can't be easy because you don't have an unlimited supply of people.
Correct.
With every single. You see this in the UFC when you have certain talents in different divisions where it becomes very difficult sometimes to find people. But typically, those who have risen to the top were not the ones that were avoiding any
Correct.
fights. They were
Right.
willing to take it on. And I think if you're a professional and you have aspirations of being a champion, whether it's on a local scene or bigger, there's no really refusing fights. Like you said, at a certain point it becomes about choosing to be a professional over your emotional connection to the situation.
right, ego plays a lot in some of these guys. Obviously, they want to get out there and get the easiest fight. You'd be surprised how many fighters will call me or message me and they already have an opponent. And they
How does that call go?
They will message me and be like, hey, can I get on the next card? And I was like, okay, well, let me look and see how full the card is. And I'll go back and look and make sure they did their medicals on time, see if their medicals are still current, whatnot. And then they're like, well, I already got this guy that wants to fight me. And then I'll go look and see who they're picking, and it's like some guy that is like 0-8.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, this guy's just looking for a win. And if it's somebody that I feel like he's not really serious about making it to the next level, I mean,
Right. He wants to bring his friends to watch him beat somebody up.
Yeah, I won't play that game. Yeah.
Well, and I think that you could maybe sign a little bit of that off onto ignorance, but hopefully, if anybody's watching this will be a valuable lesson to fighters, whether it's your first amateur fight or you're 10-0. I think the faster you adopt a professional mindset in this business, the more likely you are to succeed. And I think, and really back to what we started with, I think that's why you've done so well, is I think you're already a professional person who, had not done the business yet, but you had a business mindset and you were focused and you knew that how you interacted with the people you work with was going to be extremely valuable.
Well, a lot of people that don't know me personally or don't know my backstory, that think that, well, he got into the promoter business just to make tons of money.
Yeah.
Like that. Like, this isn't a business that you're gonna make millions of dollars in.
It's a labor of love.
Right. So it's number one, I love the sport. MMA, I fell in love with it. Jiu-jitsu, I fell in love with it when I started training back in 07, 08. But I had a business. I was running a successful business. I had been running a private ambulance service for years, and in 2010 I sold that company and I went in on this and I like I said, I didn't make money on the first shows, but after I adapted, I mean, I can provide a living for myself now.
Yeah.
But it's not all about that, But yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot, and
Yeah.
I've stuck with it, and like I said, the more shows I do, I learn something every show.
Yeah. Well, it's been really, really enjoyable watching you grow and offer this platform to really enhance the MMA scene in Texas. Moving forward, and this is a question really for both of you, what do you see the Texas MMA scene like in the next 5 to 10 years? Considering that you've now been involved in it, I mean, both of you were fighters, and you run in the promotion. Todd, you have experience both as a fighter, commentator, and now an MMA judge. What has the evolution been like locally here, and where do you see it going?
I'll say this. One thing I was surprised of whenever I decided to come back because I took a little bit of a hiatus from the local area as far as keeping track of what was going on, and so in 2016 was my first show that I worked with Eric as far as commentating and just giving my opinion on the matches, and the quality of fighting as far as the amateurs go. I mean, it's from the last 5 years has taken a leap to where it was 10 years ago. And so those amateur fighters, there's been many amateur cards, because we always kick off with the amateur card and then we go into the pros. There's been many times where the amateur card is just like red hot to where it's like a hard act to follow for the pros. And I think the difference now is you see the amateurs, there's more opportunity for the amateurs, one, and two, they see the value in getting that amateur experience and getting at least 4 to 5 amateur fights under your belt before you turn pro, because you want to run into your pro career off and running and get yourself a solid win streak to try to get signed on as soon as you can, as fast as you can, because I can tell you from firsthand experience, it's to get that momentum and get signed is kind of the easy part compared to having once you're there and keeping it, because once you're there and you get cut, it's almost like flying first class and then going back to coach. You got to grind your way back up, and then now you got that somewhat of a I wouldn't say reputation, but then you get that label that you're a certain level of a guy to where you're only gonna get matched up with the toughest guys. And if you don't fight in your local area, if they're gonna pay for you to fly out there and the travel, they're gonna try to make it worth their while. And they're going to match you with the toughest guy that they possibly can. And so the amateur experience, the guys are realizing just how important it is to have a very seasoned amateur career before they turn pro. And so that's the one thing is the level of the amateurs is what I've seen. And then Eric, you've had the last couple of shows, you've had some fighters really stand out and are really like on the cusp of either like a resurgence or some of the guys that are starting to make a name for themselves. Like we talked about Leo earlier, but your light heavyweight champion.
Oh, like Ike Villanueva. Real quick, going back to what Travis said, like in the next 5 years, if you take it 5 years back and you look at where Leomano Martinez was 5 years ago, also like Michael White's son, he just made his amateur debut.
Dude, I saw that.
17
years old.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you go back 5 years, he was 12.
Yeah, I know.
And I was 5 years into this business.
Right.
So, in the next 5 years, I mean, when he's 22, if he sticks with it and he's maybe 6-0 as an amateur, 4-0 as a pro, like that's a kid that's going to be where Leomano Martinez is right now. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the future of the sport is bright. And the area, Texas, in general, but Houston more specific, has so many fighters that are just coming out. And me, when I wasn't fortunate enough to be able to get into jiu-jitsu when I was like 11 or 12 years old. Like, I look at my son and he's 12 and he's been doing jiu-jitsu since he was 6.
Yeah.
So it's like, if he sticks with it and he decides I want to take an amateur fight or I want to do this or that, in the next 5 years, the sport, I think, is going to produce tons of talent.
Man, I think you touch on something like it's been around long enough, this MMA and jiu-jitsu, to where it's become sort of culturally significant, so that you have kids doing jiu-jitsu at 4 years old,
right,
and coming up through the ranks. And some of them have done boxing and then they start doing jiu-jitsu. And now you have pretty well-rounded MMA athletes who are teenagers.
Right.
And that's pretty scary,
Very
because
scary.
in the beginning, I remember we talked about this a lot. The early days of jiu-jitsu was about trying to find who had a VHS copy of one of the first UFCs, so you could watch the UFC and try to do what Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock were doing in your backyard with a buddy, and just see if you could and it was stupid and dangerous because we had no coaches and we had no martial artists really to learn from that weren't traditional martial arts. And now what's amazing is when you have somebody who comes up in a Muay Thai, wrestling, jiu-jitsu background and a karate background. Now you've got a really interesting, fun blend. It brings a new dynamic to the sport.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, man, we're just about out of time, man, and I want to thank you for doing this, for sharing some of the behind the scenes of running Garcia Promotions. It's an incredible event that you put on and have continued to put on and improve upon year after year. Anything you want to say last minute?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. We got a lot of stuff coming up. 223, I have this Fury 42 event. We're in Dallas 2 weeks after, San Antonio a week after, and 2020 is going to be full of action.
Looking forward to it.
And so, Travis, always a pleasure. And Eric, as you said earlier, the future is looking bright. And, to the fighters out there, we weren't able, especially the fighters in the area, there's so much talent. We weren't able to even barely scratch the surface of the people that are up and coming. Hopefully we'll be able to talk about them in a future podcast. But always a pleasure. Eric, it's going to be great working with you again. Travis, always. And that's it.
All right, guys. We'll see you on the next one. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed that, please be sure to like and subscribe to this channel. Also, don't forget to share this video with somebody else. Thank you.